concept in educational design or instructional design where there's four levels of instruction of interactivity. There's your kind of passive, slightly interactive, a little more interactive, and then immersive. And so your level four is usually like your VR immersive experience. Your level one is a PowerPoint presentation, and then you have a gradient within that. And that's something that I learned when I was working for Navy subcontractors. That's just like a big area of the work that we do there, where you're building an L2 or an L3 type of experience for a specific learning outcome. Um, so that's where that phrase levels of learning comes from, is we focus on identifying what is the level of interactivity that you need to effectively solve your learning outcome. Um, from there, once we have that understanding, the reason why we don't just label that into our find the fun is that our goal is actually not so much about engagement and retention. It's really focused on, did you actually get the learning outcome? Did you actually learn what you needed to learn effectively, regardless of the level of learning, right? So it might just be you have to read these PowerPoint presentations. That might be the best way to help you learn this, or we might throw you into a VR simulation. That might be the best way to do it. But it's more of a design uh, focus that's different for us. The technology is the same. We still end up using VR. We still end up using all of our tools and techniques, but our focus is, instead of engagement and retention, our focus is now on, did you get the learning outcomes that you needed to through this?
I met a Rick!
Welcome back to another episode of Meta Rick, where we talk about emerging technologies with founders, builders, buyers, everybody out here working on XR, AI, and any sort of kind of cutting edge technologies. Today's guest is Kyle Morrand. Kyle is awesome. He's one of my favorite people that I met at AWE back in May. Founded a creative agency focused on XR and AR kind of activations. He's worked on some super secret projects that I wish I could ask him about, but I know he can't talk about today. But we will have plenty to share in the story. So Kyle, maybe you could start by just giving us a little background, how your career kind of started and what brought you into XR.
For sure. Yeah, so I'm Kyle. I started off, honestly, I like to introduce myself as a drummer first. I've been drumming since I was 9, and that's kind of always been an important part of my story. Because all of like middle school, high school, everything, my whole like life was built around music and drumming and just being a musician. And then when I went to college, I had just this inkling of, hey, I should learn computer engineering. I don't know why. My mom's an IT, might as well learn some programming. Let's get into it. And so I kind of jumped into that space for 2 years. Was kind of bored of it, missed the creative aspects of music and creativity. And so I looked to kind of combine what I was learning in programming with some sort of creative outlet, taught myself a little bit of game design, decided, oh, I really love this. I really love this space of game design, and just kind of changed my trajectory from being a computer engineer and just getting like a traditional job, into kind of having all these ideas of how to combine game design with technology and see how that can be applied. And so I started 302 originally as a game studio looking to create new types of games and be able to work with creators to make those games. But around that time, this was in 2014, the first VR headset started coming out from Oculus, right? The DK1 and 2 I got my hands on. So as I started into the game side of things, VR kind of started coming online from a consumer space. And I fell into that, both from a creative aspect, but then also in Orlando, we've got a lot of government companies. And so I started working with some of the Navy subcontractors doing research and development for them. And that kind of led me into, I guess, being this kind of hybrid creative technologist where we apply game design and build these kind of creative projects, but then do them for real world applications like the government, or as we've kind of progressed forward as a company, healthcare and education, or attractions or marketing. And so today, kind of fast forwarding from that, we've kind of continued that trend over the last 10 years where we're taking new technologies, but then bringing a game designer's perspective and combining those two efforts to create something new uh, in an industry that may not have those types of interactive experiences yet.
One of the things that really excites me about your story, like many of the kind of founders that are building in this space, is like you said, this kind of hybrid creative technologist. It's this blend of kind of two parts of the brain working together, and it's a very unique industry to be working in for that reason, because there's this blend between the creative kind of design and the creative services and the scope around what are we actually putting out into the world, but then there's
Right.
this huge technological lift and infrastructure that goes around 3D world building and these kind of activations. So a lot of the folks that I've interviewed on the show come from something like a film background is a really common one. So the
Mm,
drumming background in music is really
right.
interesting because you still have this kind of tie into creative before diving down into kind of game development and tech. When you started this journey, so you mentioned that there's this regional based kind of government agencies and some of these R&D projects. How did that start? Did they find you somehow, or did you kind of seek them out? Like, what kind of started off those kind of relationships?
Yeah. So I live here in Orlando. Where a lot of our background is in kind of research technologies for the government. You think of like NASA's here and the moon landing started here. So there's a lot of research backing. And then there's a lot of this entertainment crowd from like Disney and Universal. So those are kind of like the two big pillars in our area. And so a lot of the community here is in these technologies either towards entertainment or towards research and development. Um, so we have a lot of activity in our community locally that when I was in college, I just started getting involved with my professors. They would hold meetups, or we used to have like a games meetup called Indienomicon where we had like 100+ game students and professionals get together just to talk about games that they're working on. Um, and so as our community kind of continue to gather and meet, I would just go out originally, just myself and my business partner, and we just make friends. Really, it was really kind of like um, our only focus. And then what I personally, I've always been like a tinkerer, so I've always loved just building things and sharing with people and just showing off what I'm doing. And I think that for most people, in terms of like first projects and clients, just kind of sparked this interest of, hey, could you help me with this problem that I've got? I've got this VR headset. I'm trying to do this, that, and the third. Um, and I've always just like being helpful. And so that was kind of like our original approach to sales, quote unquote, was just being in the community and being helpful and showing off what we could do. People will come to us and say, hey, we've got this project that we're trying to get done. Do you think this is something you can be helpful with? I'd just be honest if I could or couldn't, and have kind of just gone from there. And that's still our sales strategy today. Like I like to tell people like we don't run ads, we don't have like really like sales outbound calls or anything like that. We just help our friends solve cool problems.
I love that. I think that's a direction even like really large sales teams are starting to slowly move more and more into that world. Like a lot of SDR teams are moving into being almost more like industry evangelists. And
Right,
like 10 years ago, a software sales rep was just a software sales rep. It didn't matter if you were selling property management software or cloud software, it's still just
right,
SaaS, right? It's just
right,
software. But now that's not how it is. Now tech has gone from a few hundred companies to tens of thousands of companies. And so you kind of have to really be an expert for a particular type of customer or particular industry.
for sure.
So I think that approach is really genuine of like, hey, I build cool stuff and I want to do that for cool people and try and make that work.
Yeah,
When you were first starting, did you have any sort of like game plan or like how do you prep your energy for going out into these events? Is there like a goal? Or I think some people are just naturally very good at it. Other people kind of struggle. Like, what are some tips on how to get the most value out of picking the right events to go to and kind of how you approach one of those events that you go to?
yeah, that's a great question. So I actually am like a super big introvert. When it gets beyond like a one-on-one conversation like we're having now, I can't stand it. Like being at large events, I actually like it's very draining of my energy. And when I first started, the company even more so, right? I was like 21 and just kind of wanted to be an engineer and just wanted to code and create things. And so my business partner, who's been my best friend since I was like 4, who you met, I think Bob at AWE as well.
Yeah.
Um, when I was in college in Orlando, he was in college in Miami. And I think my very first event, I was like, hey, we're hosting this event. I am not ready for it. Do you want to come up and just talk to people about what we're doing? And so that was the first time he came up to Orlando and kind of joined us as a company. Um, and then we've done that ever since. And so kind of my kind of first advice, especially for introverts, is find somebody that's not an introvert to be kind of help for you. And how him and I balance it is he kind of casts a wide net, so he talks to everybody, right? And he enjoys talking to large groups and talking to people and all of these things. And then he finds people that he finds value in a good discussion, and then he brings them to me, and then I go deeper with them and have a deeper discussion with them. So that's how him and I have kind of strategized and balanced it. Is we'll make a lot of friends, and then he brings folks to me, and then I'll pull them aside and we'll go into deeper conversations and go from there. Um, but recently, I guess I've just gotten more comfortable because as I start going to the same events over and over, like AWE, I think I've been 5 times. Now it's more like going and just hanging out with friends. Right. So I've got a lot of friends at AWE that I see, and so it's a little bit more of a comfortable event for me that I can get on stage now and like talk because there's like 10 people that I know in the crowd. So things like that. I think going to events over and over that you have genuine interest in, you start getting more into that comfort zone as well, and building deeper relationships in that way.
That makes a ton of sense. I mean, we always hear about these amazing duos, right? Like the Jobs and Woz, right? You
Right,
got Woz building this amazing technology and understands how it all works. And then you've got Jobs as the extrovert, the marketer, the guy who knows how to create perception and draw
right.
interest to that technology. So I think that is awesome when you find a partner that complements your skill sets like that. You mentioned you guys were friends. How did you guys kind of sync up and decide to start working together?
Yeah. Yeah. So we grew up on the same street since we were like 5 years old. Um, and when I was in college, I I had that first event that I mentioned, and I was just like, "Hey, come up and like help out with this event." And he came, and that went well. And he's always been into games and technology as well. We grew up playing games together, and so as this business started formulating beyond myself, he was one of the first people I talked to with about like, hey, like, we're going to need to figure out the marketing and the business and the relationships and sales and all these things. Like, do you want to participate in that? Do you want to join on? Um, and I have another business partner, actually, Eric, who is more on the actual development side. And so he's like into the production and development and managing our creative team. And Bob's more on the marketing and sales and the relationship side of things, where I'm kind of in the middle. So it's been like they're both experts in that space, and then I'm the balance between the two of them. So it's been really effective for us. Um, and so yeah, so that's kind of how we started working with us.
That's awesome. And real quick, I'm gonna have some more questions around events and the kind of go to market. But first, I think this is a good segue to kind of shape out what the team looks like a little bit. So 302 Interactive, obviously you guys provide a lot of bespoke services and custom projects. Like I would say, like for very unique needs, you're one
Right.
of these specialists that can come in and like help launch something really special. What is like the full picture of the team look like as far as the size of the org, the skill sets? Do you work with a lot of like partners and freelancers, or is it mostly in house? Just like a little bit of color on how you shape up the agency.
For sure. Yeah. So we are a creative organization first, and we hire game designers. So that's like our primary bread and butter. I think we have 10 designers and developers on staff, that are employees. Um, and they, like I mentioned, work under Eric as their lead, delivering on our primary projects. Um, and their main focus is doing game development and design as a service towards unique projects. Um, on the other side, we've got support as well from an operations and a marketing side, but that's like a smaller side of the business. We try to stay as lean as possible there. And then recently, we've kind of extended how we operate the agency model into two programs. One is what we call Find the Fun. So we focus our game designers on looking at real world applications in healthcare, education, or whatever other solutions, and how do we find the fun using game design to apply towards a new solution. So that's one program, and we primarily do that program in house. We because we hire game designers, we keep that mostly in house, but we do work with some vendors. And then on the flip side, we have another program that I call Levels of Learning, which is focused really around how to create immersive learning for training, simulation, education, things like that, employee workforce. And that's more of a specialized area that we do work with external vendors because it's usually more technically involved. It usually requires more like hardware. Like right now, we're working on a marine solution where we've got a VR chair and a headset, and it's all custom hardware. And so we have one vendor, Talent Simulations, for that, and then we're working with a few development vendors to build the actual software solution as well. Um, so that's kind of how we've been organizing ourselves in that way. And then recently this year as well, we started doing some consulting around metaverse, Web 3.0 technologies, and that's mostly myself doing that, just bringing in from like a strategy and go-to-market perspective how to implement these technologies into an existing business. So it's been fun.
And then I feel like that's that last one, is that almost more like a lead gen process. It's like there's a little bit of consulting there, but I feel like there's also a gateway path where folks that are dabbling in that Web3 world, they tend to overlap well with those kind of that find the fun gamification, and then also
Right.
with the training development stuff you're talking about. So do you kind of use that as a way to start a conversation with someone and potentially take them down one of those paths, if it makes sense?
Yes and no. Part of it's been, like you said, it's starting the conversation and the relationship to then find the right project that works for them and build solutions from our team. But on the opposite side, what I ended up finding was because we have a specialization in game development and these solutions, I tend to pigeonhole myself into that being the focus, and that's not always what a company needs. I like to joke with companies that sometimes they try to take their problem and shove it in a VR headset, um, and sometimes you just don't need a VR headset to solve your problem. And so what I've kind of done for myself with consulting is taking a step back and try to work with organizations to say, you're interested in emerging technologies, and that's great. Let's figure out the right problems and solutions and see if we can connect the dots there. And most of the time, it actually doesn't turn into projects for our team. It turns into projects for teams in our network, just because we have good relationships with other vendors and other solutions and products that are out in the emerging technology space. Um, and so I try to keep good relationships there to make the right suggestions, but I've been trying to really keep the consulting agnostic of our development team so that I can provide the most honest solution rather than just trying to do sales towards our solutions.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like basically just being knowledgeable on the toolkit of like
Yep.
what's the most helpful. And like you might be having like whole crews of people that are specialists at these couple of tools, but then you have just a general knowledge around this other one. So you can help kind of guide people. And then if you notice a pattern where they keep on needing the same one or two tools, you could always build up a third arm of your business or a team that could deliver
Right.
on those things. But
That's
for now,
right.
having a network and partners to send people is great.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about those two arms of the business. So let's start with the find the fun concept. I love that phrasing, find the fun,
Yeah.
because this is a common theme talking to Alan Smithson, to Steve Grubbs, and some of these folks that have been around the space a long time and have a big focus on education.
Hmm.
They talk a lot about how content is competing with like AAA games. Like you've got textbooks that haven't really changed in like hundreds of years.
Right.
The actual text might be a little updated, but for the most part, the style of learning is exactly the same that it's been for a very, very, very long time.
Right.
But now these kids have attention coming from Roblox. They have attention coming from TikTok. They have attention coming from Mr. Beast on YouTube and from the big blockbuster movies and streaming platforms. And so how can we expect a textbook to really grab some of these kids' attention?
Right.
And so this idea of find the fun, it's like the real purpose, the reason why gaming technology is being used for new use cases is it's to drive that engagement. It's to create that little bit of enjoyment to make the activity easier to adopt, easier to get people to lean into. So with that program, like how do you approach like starting that conversation with a company and kind of confirming that gaming really is the way to kind of get that engagement or that fun?
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of nailed it on the head. To me, it starts with understanding if your objective, if the problem you're trying to solve is engagement or retention, then games are your best solution. Um, that's just kind of the where I start from, right? So if you're trying to do deeper retention on learning or trying to really get somebody to retain information, interactivity, and using game technologies to get that interactivity is just a common proven methodology to do so. It's what the government does. It's what educators do. It's all over the place. And so that's usually the two areas that I look to see is like, are you trying to solve an engagement problem or are you trying to solve a retention problem or both? And then we dive deeper into crafting the solution around those as kind of our core metrics. Usually for like marketing agencies, it's engagement, right? So like if you're at an event or if you're trying to get somebody's like attention really strongly, we focus around engagement and being as engaging and possible and use juice is what we call it in game design to really attract you. Or if you're trying to create retention and create kind of longer form retention, then there's good design practices to really getting you really into a flow state and then keeping you there so that we're aligning the content to that flow state.
Is that so engagement's like sparking attention, getting someone to take a look. Retention's like keeping someone engaged throughout a whole experience.
Right.
Do you find that there's kind of the two activations, one that's maybe more like surface level, we just want a lot of people to see this, and then the other one is more like an intimate kind of small audience?
Yeah, absolutely. It really just depends on the goals of the company that we're working with. Engagement, like you said, is usually like a broader base, like, hey, look over here, right? Like really just try to grab your attention and then um, but we don't always need to retain your attention. And sometimes it's actually you don't want full retention because let's say it's like a marketing agency, they're trying to get you to go do something else. The game is just a means to an end. So we want to catch your attention for 30 seconds and then the timer goes off and now go do this, call to action. Right. And so that um, is usually more focused around engagement. Whereas if we're doing something like education where we really actually want you to learn the outcome, we want you to feel constantly engaged and feel comfortable in this space so that you can gather as much information as possible and feel like you want to keep repeating that experience over and over because that's just the best way to learn. So yeah, it
Absolutely.
comes down really to the org and the problem they're solving.
Let's unpack those as two different kind of things. So with engagement, when you're trying to spark attention, whether it's a large group or a very targeted group, like you're just trying to draw them in,
Mhm.
what are some patterns you've noticed on like hurdles to overcome? Like what's blocking engagement and making it tricky to get people's attention?
Yeah, friction is the phrase we use that we really want to try to reduce. And so that comes more to the technology that you're implementing. So if you think about um, a marketing activation, the best way to get somebody engaged quickly is to have no layers of friction. You don't want them to do like a sign up form. You don't want them to have to put their phone number in to get started. You don't want to have to download an application to get started. Like any layer of friction um, reduces that level of engagement. So you want it to be as accessible and as quick as possible and find solutions that match the solution, like match what you're trying to accomplish, um, but are really bringing the user to the experience as fast as possible. Um, so that's like usually the biggest barrier to entry, and it changes depending on the environment. If you're at a large outdoor event, um, getting people to interact with your touchscreen experience and make that as accessible as possible is uh, easy. But then if you're at a large event that has bad Wi-Fi and you're asking someone to download the app so that they can engage with you and da da da, all right, now we're creating way too much friction. You're not going to get the engagement that you're looking for. So we try to really advise on understanding the environment that your users are going to be in, and then what's the best way to bring that. And that even goes to corporate settings, that you're in a controlled environment, right? Where if you want somebody to do a virtual world experience and do that for sales training, asking them to put on VR headset, maybe not the best solution. Most people don't have a VR headset on their desk, and so now they got to go to IT, they got to check out a VR headset, they got to sign up, they got to learn about so you're adding these layers of friction that are just going to reduce engagement. So for us, it's really trying to unpack the ecosystem around the experience so that you can get to that experience as fast as possible.
What's an example, or a specific example would be great, but a couple of generic concepts of solutions would
Mm-hmm.
be helpful as well. For when you're running into those issues, when you want is the least amount of friction possible, but you're still trying to use an XR solution to get this engagement to pull people in.
Yeah.
What's an example of something that works really well for that scenario?
Um, Specifically to get them into like a VR headset.
Not necessarily a VR headset. It could be other forms of XR.
Okay.
But I'm thinking that this friction problem is a big thing for XR technology in general, right? Like you
Right.
mentioned with VR headsets, it's especially big because it's a new device, it's a new learning curve. There's a tremendous amount of value, but it's got to be worth the friction. The use case has to match up well.
Right.
So there's other forms of XR though that I know have less friction than that, and so I'm wondering if there are XR solutions that are a great fit for that engagement piece,
Mm-hmm.
um, or if it's all just for retention. So if there's any thoughts that come to mind as something that does fit that engagement side.
Yeah. So we actually have a partner, it's a company called Surreal,
Oh
Xureal.
yeah, Josh Rush and those guys are really
Well, no.
talented.
So this is a different company. They're here in Orlando. They used to be called Elevux, and now their product is called Surreal. But their focus is all around sales engagement using, uh, you know, these XR technologies. And their focus is specifically on WebXR and being browser-based, being as accessible as possible towards this friction, right? So if you think
Sounds pretty
about
similar to Surreal.
it, yeah, maybe might be the same. Maybe I don't know.
um,
Hassan is the CEO over there. It's real that
Yeah,
I'm thinking of.
it sounds like a different company, but the product sounds very similar.
We'll,
Because
we'll
so
have,
it's real with Josh does they do like WebXR with pixel streaming.
okay,
Is their
gotcha.
focus. So I forget exactly how they host it, but it's like Unreal Engine built worlds that are all
Okay,
interactive through pixel streaming on browser for the most part.
interesting. Okay, yes, I've seen this. This is Surreal. I think I saw them at AWE, and yes, they are very similar. That's true.
And these names,
um,
man, it's the same reason
I
why
know.
the glasses X Real had to change, right? Weren't they? I forget exactly what happened there, but
Yeah,
anyways.
yeah. That's
so,
that's
so,
hon-
so this,
honestly it's why we've kept our name, because we're just trying not to be an industry name because it's just impossible to keep up with at this point. So
well, yeah. In 1 second it's metaverse, the next second it's spatial computing, and
right,
it's so hard to come up with something that sticks. But
yeah.
anyway, I totally cut you off. So
Oh, it's fine. It's
this
fine.
company they do web based, browser based 3D experiences.
Yes, but yes, so they do, like I said, web-based, browser-based, as their primary product. But what they've focused around is building the tools to integrate that product into a company. So they've got their own CMS, they've got their own hosting setup that they do to integrate this. You create your own instance for the company, um, and they really focus on the integration step first to make sure that their product is working for the company, and then provide XR experiences after the fact. And that I found to be very um, effective versus something like a spatial or others, where that the focus is the experience first, and then oh yeah, we can do enterprise layers afterwards. Their really focusing on being enterprise first, being as friendly to IT as possible to be integrated, and then let's bring in some XR content. And what that's allowed them to do is then be able to extend their products and say, oh, you want a VR experience? Yeah, we can do that within the same ecosystem, because now they already have a playground that they can build within for that company. Um, so I found that approach for them to be really effective, while focusing first on creating the as simple of an experience as possible, being web-based, being IT friendly. And I emphasize the IT friendly because my mom's in IT, and if you do anything that's a download or application based, even if it's on PC, you have to go through IT in a much more rigorous way, because now you're downloading across every computer at the organization versus being browser based, which is just a login single sign-on setup. So again, back to the friction scenario of understanding how you're going to bring this into a larger organization.
Yeah, it's interesting because when we think of friction, there's friction points in different angles, right? So there's friction with the user, like the actual audience you're trying to drive engagement to, whether those are employees, investors, or customers.
Right.
And so you've already listed a bunch of those friction points we want to avoid with like logins and downloads and things. But then on the other side, you've also got procurement friction, and you've got this onboarding process that you have to get through to even launch the program in the first place. And this is especially tricky with some of the more bespoke programs that your team tends to work on, because there's also a time box, right? Like some of
Mm-hmm.
these programs might take, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months to really build out a full experience that's going to fit the needs for a large activation. It's not something you can just do in 2 weeks, right?
Right.
Like it's most of the time at least, right? And so there's this weird line you kind of have to walk of how do we get started and like not lose our time box, but get through this procurement process that in itself could take 6 months to just
Right.
get through that. And so there's kind of various stakeholders involved in the buying side. And I'd be curious to get your perspective on, you kind of mentioned there's these IT groups, but who's typically involved in the buying committee for your projects? And like, what are the different perspectives that they're looking for from IT versus somebody else?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. I think for XR and like emerging technologies, in a company, there's usually like a champion, right? There's usually this like advocate that's really passionate about this technology, that's really sees a problem area in their organization or some sort of new opportunity, and they're really excited about it. And those are usually the people you talk to first. They're the ones that kind of find you and Google you and reach out to you and all that. But they may not be the decision maker. They're usually not the CEO unless it's a startup, and they're usually not like a C-level person, um, because those folks are busy on the day to day of the business. Um, and so what you end up kind of having to navigate and understand is IT is the big one, right? IT, you are building technology, so IT is going to want to get involved. But understanding the whatever team you're talking with, their stakeholders is a big area. And for me, I usually like to understand like what are your KPIs in the next like couple of years? Why are we doing this in the first place? Because it's cool and flashy, or does it align with some sort of strategy that your organization cares about deeply? Um, so I like to understand those things. And then finance is usually another area. Um, unless someone's already done projects in this space, it's usually not known that a VR experience is cost way more than building a website. And a lot of people think it's the same. They're like, oh, we'll just build another thing, but it's not the same cost. It's not the same process. Um, so that's usually another area. And then marketing, surprisingly, as well, is another point of stakeholder where we need to really um, align with their marketing goals and understand, can these guys actually market and effectively distribute this experience um, towards the solution that they're trying to, if it's going out to the end customer. um, so I back to the consulting thing, what I've been doing lately is just kind of starting to bring those people to the table as early as possible, before we, not even before we start development. We maybe will start development, but with an understanding that there are these gaps that we're going to have to fill before this project is done, so that we're ready to go to market together. Um, and the best way that I've been able to communicate that with folks is just being a company's partner in XR, metaverse experiences, whatever it is that we're focused on at that time. We focus really deeply on being partners. And if you're not okay with that relationship, then I can't work with you. I can't just build you something that's going to sit on the shelf. It doesn't work for me. So we have to be on the same page that we're not just here to build something, but we're here to help you launch it effectively. And I need to be able to bring stakeholders to the table to do so.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think these programs, because they're so complex, where you have to, like we said at the beginning, this creative and this technology, like there's these different types of offering in the service and in the product, and so you end up with different types of people that are buying it. It's almost like a like in order to sell this stuff, you kind of have to be like a project manager. Like you're kind of connecting all these different stakeholders, and the deal takes a long time to close, and so there's a lot of work that goes into kind of navigating and keeping everybody on the same page for the next step.
Right.
So very very tricky, but makes a lot of sense when it comes to retention. So we talked a little bit about engagement and like what works there, like browser based, try to avoid logins, try to avoid downloads. There's some solutions for that. When it comes to retention, what are you considering as like a good example of a high retention solution?
Hmm. That's a good question. Um, we worked on this project for a couple of years called Veripy. The company is now called Recover Health. Uh, but essentially, it's VR or XR physical therapy. So using these technologies to create games for kids to do physical therapy. Um, and the problem that they were looking to solve was when you do physical therapy, you are doing exercises that are slightly painful, and as a kid, that can be, you know, uncomfortable. And you have to come back every week and do that for 12 weeks to effectively do that. And so, in and I'm trying to remember the number because it's been a few years, but I believe it was after 4 weeks of doing physical therapy, half the people that are supposed to be doing physical therapy drop off and stop doing it. Um, And so what we were looking to resolve using games, entertainment, and some good tooling is how do we get somebody through all 12 weeks and enjoy that experience? And so that's an area where we're really focusing on retention of the experience, not just during that one play session and making sure they get from beginning to end of the play session without, taking off the headset or anything like that, but also how do we get them to want to come back week after week so that they're encouraged to do so and get through their 12 weeks and live a healthier lifestyle. Um, so that was like a kind of like my favorite use case that we've done so far. Um, and really learned a lot about not just how to build the experience during that play session, but how to make the tools so that the therapist was able to work with the kids to create a really good experience for them, and then again encouraging them to be able to come back week after week.
And how do you kind of keep track of these metrics, right? Is this something that your client is doing on their side and you just kind of agree with each other that that's information that you'll review at the end as like a success metric? Or do you have something in your offering where you tend to create an analytics portal, or how do you typically track those metrics for success?
Yeah, the analytics portal is a good question. We explored that actually a couple of years ago, but decided against it just because we prefer to build things that integrate into somebody's existing ecosystem. Um, and so typically, like I mentioned, people already have their KPIs. They understand the problem areas. We just want to align towards those. And so we'll, like you said, understand that in the beginning, and then report back on that with them as a partner so that they should be able to see that for themselves and say, oh, our number went up. That was our goal, and we have that a common understanding. So we actually try to avoid adding another piece of software to the mix as best as possible.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. It's like they already know their business and they're going to be tracking the success of it pretty rigorously, right? Like some of these programs are really expensive, like
Right.
people's jobs might be on the line to make sure that they go well. So relying on them to track what works and then just kind of working together to make sure that the solution's leading towards those goals.
Yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about this find the fun and like how to drive engagement, how to drive retention, but you mentioned another side of your business, right? So
Mhm.
this more like learning development focus. It's a little more technical. You bring in more partners. It's a different kind of offering. Walk us through a little bit of how that's different. Like, is the customer different? Is the sales process different? Like, how do you approach that versus find the fun method?
Yeah, so levels of learning, maybe a quick background on it. I get it from this concept in educational design or instructional design where there's four levels of instruction of interactivity. There's your kind of passive, slightly interactive, a little more interactive, and then immersive. And so your level four is usually like your VR immersive experience. Your level one is a PowerPoint presentation, and then you have a gradient within that. And that's something that I learned when I was working for Navy subcontractors. That's just like a big area of the work that we do there, where you're building an L2 or an L3 type of experience for a specific learning outcome. Um, so that's where that phrase levels of learning comes from, is we focus on identifying what is the level of interactivity that you need to effectively solve your learning outcome. Um, from there, once we have that understanding, the reason why we don't just label that into our find the fun is that our goal is actually not so much about engagement and retention. It's really focused on, did you actually get the learning outcome? Did you actually learn what you needed to learn effectively, regardless of the level of learning, right? So it might just be you have to read these PowerPoint presentations. That might be the best way to help you learn this, or we might throw you into a VR simulation. That might be the best way to do it. Um, but it's more of a design uh, focus that's different for us. The technology is the same. We still end up using VR. We still end up using all of our tools and techniques, but our focus is, instead of engagement and retention, our focus is now on, did you get the learning outcomes that you needed to through this? And the stakeholders for that usually ends up being the instructors themselves. So we're building experiences for instructors, and they're the ones that say, okay, this is now helping me get these learning outcomes for my students in a more effective way. Um,
That's
so
really interesting.
that's yeah,
So
that's been a big change.
there's like a big difference in types of things that you could learn. So it makes sense to have different design, right? So like there's something as simple as like how do you avoid phishing emails, and there's like annual cybersecurity training or sexual harassment training or some of these kind of basic things that we all need to know and we need to have refreshers on, but they're pretty simple.
Right.
You just kind of go through the process, right? So like traditional LMS systems oftentimes can work really well for that. But then you've got more complex things where it's like, how do I replace this turbine on this jet that I'm working on? And that might be a lot more difficult and more parts involved and more specialization. There's a lot of pushback on VR experiences for things like welding. I saw recently where
Mm.
they're like, "Oh, but if you're going to be a welder, you need to weld stuff." And I'm like, "Yes, yes, you do. But do you need to weld stuff for 3 months, or could you do a lot of that in VR, where
Right.
someone maybe can not afford a welding setup or to go to a place where they can access all the equipment, but they can go into a canned VR experience, learn a lot of it, and then go weld things for a couple days and be just as good."
Right.
Um, and so I'm wondering for you if you find like hard skills versus soft skills, like what are the types of learning experiences people tend to lean into for XR?
Hmm.
And then some of the outcomes that you might have experienced as far as like people did retain the information better or they did learn faster or save costs or like any sort of results that you've seen from any of these programs.
Yeah, that's great. Um, so I would say hard skills and soft skills. We've seen both, um, and I think they have two different design patterns. Um, Hard skills are great in interactive technology, just like you said, for welding, um, because it's all about repetition, right? If you get your reps in, you build your muscle memory, you can deeply understand what you're doing, and you can fail faster in virtual spaces because you don't have the cost of failure and all of these things. And so allowing for that experimentation and failure and repetition for hard skills specifically becomes really powerful. And that's just kind of like a tried and true, from like a simulation and training perspective, that's like a super tried and true aspect of learning, um, is just getting your repetitions in over and over, and making that as simple as possible. Um, on the soft skills side, it's an area that I enjoy and want to see come about more, um, and find projects for ourselves to work on more, because to me that's a lot more about storytelling. Um, where you're now using these technologies more in a way to capture and tell emotional stories based off of what soft skills you're trying to learn. That might be teamwork and the outcomes of teamwork and the challenges of teamwork, or it might be what we've seen like patient empathy training. So how to communicate effectively to a patient when they're bawling their eyes out because something's wrong, right? And how do you do that and practice that type of experience? And so that one we've actually found can't teach in the level one PowerPoint presentation, right? Like to just say like this person's crying, what do you do? Like it's hard to make a true false quiz out of that experience. Um, but if you can deeply immerse them into the experience of it and create the chaos around them of this patient hospital situation, middle of COVID, trauma's happening, and you've got this patient, you've got to communicate with them and connect with them. Now that's a really powerful story that is going to connect with that, learning doctor, um, and give them that experience that if they do that 10 times, they'll be ready for it when it happens on the floor. Um, so those types of experiences I'm starting to see kind of take shape. And I think COVID kind of amplified that, especially in the healthcare space. But I'm hoping to see more of that, see more kind of empathy and emotional storytelling in training.
What are some of the alternatives that, like, without XR, how are people trying to achieve that soft skills training
Mm, mm.
without the technology?
Yeah, without technology, I think a lot of it's been role play, is what I've seen. I've also seen like board games be made, which is cool. So a mix of like role play and board games, where you take experts and people that'll come in either as like actors or professionals that have experienced this, um, and they'll just role play. They'll go through scenarios together, which is again where XR can be really effective in doing so. And then the other area I think has been um, I don't want to say like case studies, but people coming in and sharing their stories, right? So creating that again emotional impact by sharing their stories of how they effectively led a team or how their team fell apart, right? If you've read like the five dysfunctions of a team, so areas like that, where somebody will come in and share that story um, on a personal basis and be able to create that emotional impact and then be able to be like a role model for that person. Um, which is why I think storytelling virtually can be a really powerful tool for doing soft skills training.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that, like, guest speaker telling a story, and that's like almost more passive. Like, you can almost have a video of them explaining it.
Hmm.
If they're in person, it's probably even more impactful. But that's
Right.
interesting, like driving this emotional empathy into the story. The first one, though, the board games thing, it actually reminded me of an example on one of the sales teams that I worked on. Our VP did this exercise at an SKO where he basically split us into groups, and we had a sheet of like it was like a scenario where
Mm.
you're on a ship and the ship is broken in the middle of the ocean and you're gonna die in a certain amount of time, and there's like a certain set of objects that are on the boat, and you might get help or not. Like, you have no idea if a boat's coming, so it's like a survival scenario where,
Hmm.
as a group, you first individually rank the items from most to least important, and then as a group you re-rank them based on everybody's rankings, and then at the end we all come back together and we review our rankings versus like the recommendation from the US government or something, or
All
from
right.
the Coast Guard's recommendations.
That's interesting.
And then we find that as a group we were closer to accurate than we were individually trying to rank them. It was interesting. It was like an interesting exercise. It was kind of a way to like create a scenario and have everybody work together and do team building and highlight the importance of team building.
Right.
But I heard a similar example recently using VR, and it's actually a game. But it's this game. I forget what it's called, but it's like you're trying to defuse a bomb.
Oh, yeah. Don't talk and nobody explodes.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Like, one person's in the headset, they can see the bomb, and they're trying to describe what they see, and then everybody outside has the schematics, and they're trying to tell you which wires to cut and how to defuse the bomb.
Yeah.
And I thought like stuff like that could be really fun, where it's like it really is like a game, but at the same time, you're kind of training and bringing in those soft skills and like
Right.
creating that kind of bonding experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think to your point, it that game is great because it's one person in a VR headset, and then the rest of the group has like pieces of paper and information that they've got to use. And so, not needing to always virtualize everything, right? You don't need everybody to be on a laptop to play this game, or everybody in a VR headset to play this game. You've found the point of engagement that is effective for using VR, and then the rest of the experience can be paper and pen, and that's as effective, if not even more so, than if they were all in VR together, because it actually creates this dynamic that uh, creates a better bonding experience. To your point, so yeah,
Yeah,
I love that game.
this blending of different tool sets. Like I always joked about not everything needs to be 3D. Like for example, every video game I've ever played has
Right,
a map, and the map is a 2D navigation to go see
right,
where I want to go and everything. If I want to order a Chipotle burrito, I don't need a digital twin of a Chipotle. Like I can roll through
right,
DoorDash, and that's just fine. It's probably
right.
easier. Could I have a 3D floating burrito in my DoorDash UI? That'd be kind of cool, maybe, just because
Yeah.
it's engaging. But is it going to retain me a whole lot? I don't know. But there's another question I wanted to ask you about events because I know we've only got so many minutes left. When it comes to events, this has been a really big topic for some of the folks that I work with, where there's industry events like AWE that are amazing. If you work in XR, you get to catch up. I get to meet someone like you that's like worked in the space for a while. We have a lot of similar interests and we can share best practices. Really incredible experience to go to a few of those every year. But are you going to get a ton of customers out of it? Maybe, maybe not. It's more kind of native XR folks than it is
Hmm.
new people to the industry. And then there's other types of events that are not XR related at all that are just super niche to like healthcare or to automotive or to whatever.
Right.
And I know that you host some community events, and it seems like that's been a big part of how you've grown your business and grown your career. So I'm wondering if you have any criteria you look at choosing like this is an event that's worth our time to invest in, or if you have kind of a calendar, how do you approach which events that you want to actually go to?
Yeah, yeah, great question. Events is like I mentioned, Bob, my business partner's bread and butter. So, we've built our business and our growth around events, which has been fun. Um, we approach it in layers, like you mentioned, and I'll start with the community. Um, our focus here in Orlando is to be the shop that you go to if you need something in emerging technologies. Like that is our brand here in town, specifically around XR and now getting into AI. But if you need something and you have a question about R&D or building emerging technologies, our goal is for us to be the guys that you come to. And so to do that, we have to be present, right? Like the main priority in the community is just be present at everything we can be advocates, be helpful, be volunteers, host our own events. And so we really try to support the community. Like I've got my Orlando Meta Center shirt on. We're super big advocates of our community because it's just since I was one developer working solo, the community has always kind of kept us fed and growing. And so it's just a really strong relationship that we have with the overall community in Orlando. Um, so that's kind of our first layer. The second layer is, like you mentioned, technology events like AWE or GDC, which is the Game Developers Convention. Um, Things like PAX or um, CES, areas like that, where it's more technology focused, it's more around consumer technology, and it feels like we're just talking to ourselves a lot of the time, which is great because we can learn best practices, we can learn new things from each other. We use those events really to form new partnerships, so find people that have skills that we don't have and form partnerships because our goal is that we don't want to do everything. We want to do deeply what we're good at doing and then have partners so that when a customer says, I need an AI solution and a blockchain solution and this, that, and the third, we don't do those things, but we've got the partners to do so, and we pull those people together. And we've actually started formalizing those relationships now into an organization we call Lab 3, um, which was started by myself and two others here in Orlando, and the focus there is it's essentially a consortium of agencies that are focused on building better realities using emerging technologies. Um, so we're building membership for that. We're actually going to be announcing a bunch of stuff for that next year. Um, but that's just been like a big part of our success is that we never have to tell a customer no, because we've got somebody that can do it for us. And then the third layer is where we actually find the work is everywhere else. We've been to all kinds of things. We've been to the Surf Expo, the Kitchen and Bath Expo, where they've got people that are showing off the latest and greatest of drawers, right? We've gone to health, not hippo, what's it called? Man, I forget the name, but it's like the health expo. We've gone to education expos in Tampa. We've gone to Bob recently was at Texas for the Industrial Metaverse Expo. Really, just everything else, every other aspect of life is where we end up finding our actual clients and projects because those are the folks that are looking at our industry and saying, what could I possibly do with that? Right. And we found really interesting opportunities where, like kitchen and bath as an example, if you're installing a new cabinet set for somebody and you want to upsell them on that and have them be able to find those options. All right, well, now we can build an AR experience where you're showing that off and you're showing the different colors inside of the person's home and they can make that purchasing decision. That shouldn't come from our industry. It comes from the kitchen and bath experts, right? And so that's been our priority when we're looking for new projects and new relationships is we go out there and really focus on educating. So we just really want to be advocates and educators of the technology. We'll go out and do presentations and do workshops so that we can help folks learn about the technology from within their industry.
I love the approach where it's kind of similar to when you're trying to pick which technology you're offering when you're pitching a client. It's like you've defined problem statements and like the reason for the activity. So like the community driven local events have a different goal and there's a different mindset going into that. And then the XR and the industry events, there's a different goal, there's a different metric for deciding which events and like what makes sense. And then the client facing events is totally different too. Like each of those have kind of their own purpose,
Right.
but they each have a purpose and they're kind of been beneficial to you in different ways. The thing that I find personally at these events, I love the immediate feedback. Like the fact that I can say a similar pitch like 100 times to 100 people within a
Right.
couple hours. It's like you see the body language and the facial response. It's like, oh wait, I used too many sentences there and I lost them, or that industry term doesn't really resonate outside of my industry. Like I need to kind of rephrase that, and you
Right.
just get these kind of instant feedback on kind of how to hone in how you say things. But then the second one is what you mentioned is like you learn new problems, like things about an industry that you might not have known if you didn't go talk to 100 people that sell cabinets. And then all of a sudden you find out more about how they sell their cabinets and how they talk to their customers, and new ideas start to come up for use cases. So that makes a lot of sense to me. I see a
Yeah.
ton of value in the engagement of these events.
The thing that you mentioned about going and getting the feedback, um, as a technical person that's like deeply loves the technology and all the technical terms for things, it's so important to go out and talk to people because you see the eyes glaze over when you explain some new technology. And we've got new technology every 3 to 6 months. And so finding new ways to explain, like explaining Chat GPT to people and like actually explaining it to them without them just like glossing over. Um, it's a super good practice, especially as you're doing emerging technologies and something new comes out every quarter, that you take it and take your understanding of it, but then go out and actually try to explain it to somebody, right? Like we talk about like explaining it to someone's grandma. If you can't do that, then you don't really understand it and you're not gonna be able to sell it. So I find it really effective for me to just, when I have new ideas for things, I just go and start telling people about it and then watch their eyes glaze over and figure out, all right, how do I explain this? And you know, and be humble about it. Like you can't, yeah, you have to have the humility to be able to do that.
Yeah, it's like going in without an expectation, but being optimistic and just like
Yeah,
sharing the story. Like that. This has been my obsession recently. Is like introducing VR to people that are not XR people,
yeah,
because I want to know like why aren't people buying headsets? Why aren't they using them more when they buy them? Like, what's the pause? Because I've talked to so many people through this podcast at these events, and I've heard so many people that did get the bug where they tried VR and they were like, "Whoa, I need to do everything and anything in this space."
Right.
And so I get very curious, like what makes this person different than that person? What do they need to see for this to be valuable? And kind of move it away from a conversation that's like adopt XR, and move it more into, well, what are your problems? Like,
Right.
is XR even the right solution? Like is it VR or is it WebXR or is it neither? And do you really just need like a SaaS platform, which could be the answer too?
Right.
But I want to double click on these customer facing events, because I think a lot of folks struggle to decide whether or not to buy tickets and invest in these kind of customer facing events or not.
Hmm.
And a lot of people just they don't have that muscle on sales teams all the time. There's a lot of field marketing teams and groups that are really good at this, but I'm curious to get your take. You mentioned a wide variety. How do you find those, and create a list of the events that you want to go to? And then when you pick one, what's the approach? Like how do you prepare going into one of those events?
Yeah. Good questions. I think that comes back to, as a company, understanding your why is maybe a good first step to that. Um, like, what is your why as a company? So for us, um, we have a phrase that where we say we're trying to turn everyday life into a playful experience. And that's our focus. And so we look at how to take game design and apply it into the real world to turn an aspect of life into something more playful. And so that aspect of life part becomes um, like our first layer of, are we building this technology for somebody for the sake of technology, or is it impacting somebody's life in a positive way and playful way? um, and then from there, I and a couple others on our team, we are kind of regularly discussing just topics and social trends, rather than looking at technology trends and what's happening with AI and all these things. We look at like what's happening just in daily life and socially and all of these things. And we have discussions about the future of education, or when COVID happened, how that was impacting healthcare, and we try to find, or I try to find topics within those conversations that are interesting for myself and for my team. And then those topics, I say, I'm really interested in that educators are having a hard time keeping up with the pace of technology, and they're having a hard time bringing that technology um, into the classroom. Let's go find some people that are focused on the classroom, right? And so then we find events that are around education and the classroom and instructional design and all these things, and get involved in those communities with a genuine interest in, how do we help you solve your problem, right? So we try to find, before we even meet customers, we try to find problems and topics that are genuinely interesting to us. And I think that's really important, rather than like chasing just the big dollar sign, because you're going to be working on this project creatively, ideally for a year or 2 years, right? Like, you're gonna be working on it for a while, so hopefully you care about it, or it's gonna be very draining for you and your team. So I try to go from that perspective of like, what does my team care about? Like, an example, our marketing manager Mike, his background is actually in culinary arts, like that he started in like the culinary arts, right? Nobody else on my team does that. But it's an interest for him. There's the culinary arts and hospitality and all of these things. And so we've had conversations of where we've met folks from like Darden and a couple others that, maybe we'll work on a project in the food and beverage industry, because Mike is generally interested in it. And so now that resonates with the team. And so there you go from there. Um, that's been our approach. It's kind of an inside out approach.
I like that a lot. I like two of the things you mentioned. One, like taking genuine interests and pulling that into business outcomes, I think is really underrated. Really, really underrated, especially for small companies. Like big companies kind of already know how to make money, and like they've figured out their profit margins and their outbound and their marketing. And it's more about turning that up or down. And then there's dedicated experimentation teams. But if you're like a small little company, you've got a massive addressable market that you can go after, and it's going to make way more sense to figure out like what interests you and excites you, and start there. Because one, you're going to know more about it. You're going to naturally spend more time leaning into learning about it and working on it. And it's going to just be easier to get outcomes faster. So back when I was at Snapwire and we were kind of bringing on more salespeople, that was a big thing we used to talk about constantly is like, hey, if you're really into fitness, then find some fitness brands to go reach out to. If you're really into, I don't know, like water skiing or running or whatever, like whatever you're interested in,
Right.
go find some brands that are related to that and try and start conversations with them. And we'll see if there's a use case there. And maybe that's a new market for us to lean into. So I love that. The second thing I like is that your approach to events is less driven by what are our already doing a lot of successful projects in, and it's more about how do we go learn about a new use case, because
Hmm.
that really ties into what we just talked about of like when you go talk to the people, it's this opportunity to validate ideas and kind of hone in a pitch very quickly. So you could go to this 2 or 3 events in education, learn about that use case that you were curious about, and then come out of those 2 or 3 events with a pitch now that like you can be more targeted and go make some ads or go reach out to people or just have the conversations in a more thoughtful way
Hmm.
because you've now done those kind of community driven activations. When you go kind of prepare for going to one of those education events, let's just lean into that as an example.
Hmm.
What does the preparation look like? Is it just kind of like, hey, we're gonna go out to this and just kind of go try and meet as much people as we can? Do you guys like buy a table for drinks to invite people to? Do you like what's the approach for kind of going into one of these?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think Bob and I's approach specifically is making friends in, especially in a new space, right? So be respectful of like this is not our industry. These are not our friends yet. We don't know you guys, and so we can't just like walk around with a big stick. We gotta go in there humbly and looking to learn and looking to make new friends and genuinely understand what's going on. And so sometimes we'll do that from if it's something brand new, um, we'll come in with just fresh eyes and just meet people and just say, hey, we're just genuinely interested in this area. We're just looking to meet somebody. Sometimes we'll even find within our network somebody that's a part of that industry and invite them to come along with us. Like, hey, have you been to this event before, or have you gone? Do you know folks in this space? And yes or no, regardless, like come along with us, because that allows it to be a little more authentic. They can speak from their subject matter, and we already have that relationship, and um, it makes it a little bit smoother to then meet other people similar to that friend that we already have. So that's one thing that we do. And then if it's something where we've already been working in that space for a while, like education, um, we'll maybe bring some knowledge with us. So either I'll like ask if I can do a talk or a panel, or sometimes we'll do a booth if it makes sense to. The booth is kind of like a last resort, to be honest. Um, and I think that's back to kind of our culture of play and interactivity where we rather do something more engaging than just like a booth with some flyers. And so to your point, like when we go to AWE, actually the first night I always buy like a couple bottles of champagne and just like walk around and give people champagne at the bar, because it's just an easy way to make friends, right? Like everybody's like, oh snap, like everybody's at the bar, they're there, like here's a couple bottles of champagne, and we just genuinely are there to make friends. um,
I love
it's
that mindset of we're there to make friends because like this is my approach to like LinkedIn outreach in general too. Is
Yeah,
like sometimes it's like, hey, I think this is a great lead and I want to book a meeting and like I'm not afraid to be a salesperson. I'm not trying to hide it.
right,
But there's other times where it's like I if it turns into a sales meeting, awesome. But I really just want to meet you. Like I'm learning about your experience by looking at your profile. You look awesome.
right.
And so this idea of just trying to network for the sake of meeting cool people and learning about them, I think is a really underrated mindset. But what you were saying about the champagne reminded me like back in college, we used to host a lot of parties. We were kind of like the core house where a lot of folks would come over. And when we first started making friends, my roommate did this amazing thing where he would just make chocolate chip cookies. And just all the time, like anytime a neighbor would walk by, he'd be like, "Hey, do you want a cookie?" And he'd just give out chocolate chip cookies, and we'd constantly getting like and this is all credited to him. Like I didn't start this, but he got like a deep fryer, and we would make churros where it's like 2-3 a.m. late night college party vibes, and
Right.
there's no more pizza, there's no more any food that anyone can get. We're like, let's make some churros, and then all of a
Right.
sudden it creates this community effect, right? Like this bonding through giving. I've found is like something
Mm.
I've taken away from that degenerate college party experience, and found ways to bring that into a professional setting and into my adult life, where it's like just these little hints of giving, those social dynamics, like they
Right.
still matter. They kind of give off a good impression.
It's funny you say that specific story, and I've not connected the dots of this in this way, but um, in college, 302 was my apartment, and the name came from we would always leave our apartment door open, me and my roommates, and our whole building was always invited to come play games. We had every game console from the NES to the PlayStation 4 at the time. We had everything, and we would just have an open door for people to come and play games with us, and we would just hang out and all these things. And so our name became 302 as like the three of me and my roommates. People just, hey, what up, 302? Like that was just our name. And so when I needed an LLC, I had no idea what I wanted to call it, so I just 302 LLC, and that's just been the name ever since. But it comes again from that same like just being inviting and building social community and all of that in an organic way, and just making friends. Right? That's just been our approach as a culture.
I remember this is like the reason I even invited you to come on the podcast in the first place. Actually, is I remember you telling me the story at AWE. And
Yeah.
the first company I ever tried to start was called 1021 Studios, as in
Okay. Yes.
1021
I think we talked
Restaurants
about
in
this.
Barbara,
Right.
because my roommate and I did a similar thing. Like we had an open door policy, we had a GameCube for Smash Bros. And Call of Duty Zombies, but we got together and wanted to create a YouTube channel. And so we called it 1021 Studios, and we never really did anything with it, to be honest, but we had a ton
Yeah.
of brainstorming sessions. And when you said that as the backstory of 302 Interactive, I was like, whoa, that's crazy. Like, how often does something like that happen twice, And you actually
Yeah.
did it. Like, you turned it into a full-on agency. You're doing amazing work.
Yeah. Thank you.
On that note, I know we're a little over time already, so I really appreciate you hanging on. But before we go, where can people find you? Where can people learn more about 302 Interactive? Anything that you want to plug? This would be the time for that.
Yeah. So 302, best way is just on our website, 302interactive.com. We post pretty much everything there. We've also been pretty active lately on like YouTube, and then primarily LinkedIn. So both for the company and for myself, I'm mainly on LinkedIn if you want to reach out. LinkedIn's the best place to do it. I check there a lot. And yeah, those are probably the best spaces.
Sweet. We'll put some links down in the description so it's easy for people to find.
Cool.
And Kyle's one of the most active people in that Orlando community right now, which is really thriving as far as the technical innovation and kind of growing as a region. So definitely keep an eye out for Kyle at events and whatnot.
Yeah, if
Otherwise,
anyone's ever in Orlando, feel free to reach out. Happy to give you a tour.
amazing. Thanks so much, Kyle. Appreciate the time.
Yeah, man.
I met a